In many corners of the internet, early retirement is often presented as a simple equation. Save aggressively, invest consistently, reach a number. And once that number appears in your investment account, the story seems to end there. You are free. No more commuting. No more meetings that should have been emails. No more trading hours of your life for a paycheck. For millions of people, this idea has a name: FIRE. Financial independence, retire early. At its heart, the movement carries a powerful promise. Not wealth for luxury, but wealth for time. The promise that if you manage money carefully enough, you can reclaim decades of life that traditional retirement postpones. Instead of working until your mid-60s, the idea asks a different question. What if work became optional much earlier? What if financial independence arrived while you were still young enough to shape the next chapters of your life? For many people, that promise feels deeply attractive. A weekday morning with no alarm clock, no rush hour traffic, no inbox quietly filling with requests before breakfast. Just time. Time to read. Time to travel. Time to rest. Time to explore interests that were postponed for years. Stories like this appear everywhere. A software engineer who saved most of his income and left corporate life before 40. A couple who kept their lifestyle modest and built enough investments to step away from full-time work years earlier than expected. A teacher who decided that financial independence could allow her to reshape her career and spend more time with family. These stories often appear as proof that early retirement is not only possible, it can be transformative, and in some cases it truly is. But behind the success stories lies a quieter question that receives far less attention. Not whether financial independence can be reached, but what happens after it begins. Because stepping away from full-time work at 40 is not the end of a journey. It is the beginning of a very long experiment, one that can last 4 decades or more. An experiment where the variables are not only financial, they are psychological, social, behavioral, and deeply human. So instead of arguing about formulas, let's observe a thought experiment. A 40-year retirement experiment. One person, one decision, and a very long future. Let's call our subject Alex. Alex is not a billionaire, not a famous investor, not someone who built a tech company and sold it for millions. Just someone who followed the financial independence playbook carefully. He spent his 20s and 30s working in the technology industry. The pay was good. The hours were long. Like many professionals, his weeks slowly filled with familiar routines. Morning commutes, Slack notifications, back-to-back calendar blocks, Sunday evenings that carried a quiet sense of pressure about the coming week. By his early 30s, Alex discovered the idea of financial independence. At first, the concept sounded surprisingly simple. Spend less than you earn. Invest the difference. Repeat consistently for many years. Over time, investments begin to grow. Dividends accumulate. Market returns compound. Eventually, the portfolio may reach a point where it can support everyday living expenses without relying entirely on employment income. Money begins doing some of the work that once depended entirely on your time. Alex decided to try. He did not live an extreme life, but he made deliberate choices. Instead of upgrading apartments every few years, he stayed in a modest place that suited his needs. Instead of chasing a newer luxury car, he kept an older vehicle that still worked perfectly well. Instead of raising his lifestyle every time his salary increased, he increased the amount he invested. Over 15 years, those decisions added up. Savings accumulated. Investment accounts expanded. And slowly, the number began to approach. The number many people in the FIRE community talk about. The point where your investments may be able to support your life. For Alex, that moment arrived shortly after his 40th birthday. On paper, the plan appeared sustainable. If markets behaved reasonably, if spending stayed controlled, if life remained relatively stable, then the portfolio might last. Alex handed in his resignation. Some co-workers congratulated him. Some were confused. One friend asked a simple question over lunch. "So, what are you going to do all day?" At the time, the question sounded almost funny. After all, Alex had just gained something incredibly valuable. Freedom. Freedom from meetings. Freedom from office politics. Freedom from the quiet sense that his time belonged to someone else's schedule. For the first time since childhood, Alex woke up without a work calendar defining the day. The experiment had officially begun. And at first, early retirement felt almost magical. The first Monday without work did not feel like Monday at all. There was no alarm clock, No calendar reminder, no morning rush, just sunlight coming through the window and a day that belonged entirely to him. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Alex had no predetermined schedule. He began filling his days with things he had postponed for years. Long morning walks, books that had been waiting on the shelf, cooking meals slowly instead of rushing through lunch between meetings. Sometimes he sat in a cafe on a weekday afternoon and noticed something strange. Everyone else seemed busy. Office workers moving quickly between buildings, parents picking up children from school, delivery drivers navigating crowded streets. But Alex was simply there, not because it was the weekend, but because every day now felt a little like a weekend. He traveled more, visited places he had promised himself he would see someday. A quiet coastal town, a national park he had bookmarked years earlier, a museum on a Tuesday afternoon when the halls were nearly empty. Online communities often describe this stage as the honeymoon period, and the name fits. Stress fades. Time expands. Life slows down. People who leave demanding jobs often say they feel like they can finally breathe again. For many, it is the first time in years that they are not living according to someone else's schedule. But something subtle also begins happening during this phase. At first, it is easy to miss, because nothing is technically wrong. The days are pleasant. Life is calm. But the structure that work once provided slowly disappears. Work, for all its frustrations, organizes life in powerful ways. It tells you when to wake up, when to show up, when to push toward a goal, when the week begins, and when it ends. Without that structure, time behaves differently. Monday begins to resemble Saturday. Wednesday feels like a quiet Sunday afternoon. Weeks blur together more easily than expected. Eventually, the novelty softens. This does not mean the plan failed. It simply means freedom has stopped feeling like a vacation and started becoming everyday life. And that is when a deeper question quietly appears. Around Alex's 5th year of early retirement, the question became harder to ignore. Not a financial question, a personal one. What exactly should someone do with the next 40 years of their life? For most of modern history, work has done more than generate income. It has also shaped identity. When people meet someone new, one of the first questions they ask is simple. What do you do? For decades, Alex had a clear answer. He worked in technology. He built systems. He solved problems. He belonged to projects, deadlines, and teams. Now the answer felt less obvious. Sometimes he said he was taking time off. Sometimes he said he was working on personal projects. Both were partly true. Neither fully captured reality. The truth was that Alex had entered a stage of life most people do not experience until much later. A stage where financial pressure had eased, but the next chapter of purpose was still unclear. At first, he filled the space with hobbies: photography, writing, volunteering in community programs. These activities were enjoyable, but they felt different from the work he used to do. Work creates momentum, deadlines, collaboration, the sense that something must move forward. Hobbies can be meaningful, but they do not always create the same rhythm. And this experience is not unique to Alex. Many people who reach financial independence discover something similar. The first phase feels like liberation. The second phase feels like a question. Some realize that the absence of work also removes something unexpected, a daily sense of direction. This does not mean early retirement is a mistake. For many people, stepping away from stressful or unfulfilling work can be one of the healthiest decisions they ever make. But it reveals something important. Freedom from obligation does not automatically create purpose. Purpose usually has to be built intentionally. Over time, many people in the financial independence community quietly adjust the goal. Not from work to no work, but from forced work to chosen work. Some start small businesses. Some teach. Some volunteer. Some return to part-time work not because they need the income, but because they miss the engagement and structure meaningful work can provide. In that sense, financial independence often changes the relationship with work rather than eliminating it completely. But our experiment is still early. Alex is only about 10 years into retirement, and the next phase of the experiment will test something even less predictable than identity: the market. About 10 years into Alex's retirement, something happened that every long-term investor eventually experiences. The market fell. Not dramatically at first, just a few uneasy weeks. Headlines appeared. Investors grew cautious. Prices drifted lower. At first, Alex was not too worried. Anyone who has invested long enough understands that markets move in cycles. Up, down, recovery, growth again. For someone still working, a market downturn often feels temporary. A paycheck continues arriving. Savings continue growing. Time remains an ally. But for someone living entirely from investments, the experience feels different. Because when the market falls, it is not just a number on a screen. It becomes part of everyday life. One morning, Alex checked his portfolio and noticed something unsettling. It had dropped by nearly 20%. For many investors, a decline like that is uncomfortable but manageable. For someone withdrawing income from that same portfolio, the situation becomes more complicated. Every withdrawal now removes a larger percentage of what remains. This is where the mathematics of retirement behaves differently than many people expect. There is a concept often discussed in retirement planning called sequence risk. The idea is simple. Two investors can experience the same average market return over time and still end up with very different outcomes depending on when losses occur. If market losses appear early in retirement, recovery can take longer, because withdrawals are happening while the portfolio is already shrinking. It is like drawing water from a well during a dry season. You are still taking water out, but the rain has not returned yet. For Alex, the numbers began to feel less theoretical. Each month required a decision. Should he reduce spending, delay certain plans, withdraw slightly less? These moments are rarely dramatic. They look like ordinary life. A postponed trip, a delayed renovation, more time reviewing financial statements, small adjustments that accumulate quietly over time. This is why the psychological side of early retirement can be as important as the financial side. FIRE is often presented as an escape from financial stress. In reality, it can transform one type of uncertainty into another. Instead of worrying about job security, you begin watching market cycles more closely. Instead of negotiating salaries, you negotiate with volatility. And sometimes the hardest part is not the mathematics. It is the patience required to live with uncertainty over long periods of time. But markets are only one variable in a 40-year retirement experiment. Life itself is the next one. By the time Alex reached his early 60s, nearly 2 decades had passed since he left his job. The experiment had already lasted longer than many careers. And during that time, something quietly reshaped the original plan: life. When Alex designed his financial independence strategy in his late 30s, his projections assumed something reasonable: that spending would remain relatively stable. Not perfect, just predictable enough. But life rarely follows projections perfectly. Around this time, Alex's parents began needing more support. Aging changes family rhythms. Medical appointments become more frequent. Travel becomes more complicated. Sometimes support means time. Sometimes it means financial help. These are not unusual events. They are ordinary parts of life. But they rarely appear in simple retirement spreadsheets. Then, the ones that accumulate slowly. Groceries cost a little more. Insurance increases. A roof eventually needs repair. An older car must be replaced. A home may need adjustments as life evolves. None of these events are dramatic. That is precisely why they matter. Because over decades, ordinary life can become financially significant. Another shift happens too. Social circles change. Friends who are still working live on different schedules. Some move away. Some remain busy with careers long after Alex stepped away from his. This stage can feel quieter than people imagine when they picture early freedom. Not necessarily lonely, but different. Because retirement at 60 feels different from retirement at 40. Early retirees often live through both phases: the energetic years of exploration and the slower years of maintenance, care, and reflection. This does not mean the experiment failed. In many ways, Alex's life remains deeply fulfilling. He still has time. He still has autonomy. He still has flexibility that many people never experience. But the experiment reveals something important about financial independence that is not always emphasized. Early retirement is not just about saving enough money. It is about navigating decades of change. Markets change. Families change. Health changes. Costs change. Priorities change. And financial plans must adapt along the way. In other words, the hardest part of FIRE may not be reaching the number. The hardest part may be living with the uncertainty that follows it. And eventually, the experiment reaches its final stage, the one no spreadsheet can fully predict: time itself. By the time Alex turned 70, the experiment had lasted 30 years. 30 years without a traditional job. 30 years of living from investments that once felt like a distant goal. And in many ways, the plan had worked. Alex still had financial independence, still had control over his time, still had the freedom that motivated the journey in the first place. But something else had become clear. Time behaves differently than expected. When Alex first retired at 40, the future looked enormous. 40 years felt abstract, distant, almost theoretical. But when those years unfold in real life, the horizon changes shape. Years pass faster than expected. Decades become chapters. Friends age. Families evolve. Cities change. And the one variable that quietly stretches beyond the original spreadsheet is longevity. Living longer is one of life's greatest gifts. But financially, it creates an unusual challenge. Retirement once lasted 10 or 15 years for many people. Now it can last 30, sometimes more. Early retirement stretches that timeline even further. Someone who leaves full-time work at 40 may need their portfolio to support life for 45 years or more. That is longer than many careers themselves. This is why retirement planning is often described as risk management, not just savings. Not because the plan is weak, but because the timeline is extraordinarily long. Over 4 decades, many things will change. Markets will rise and fall many times. Inflation will reshape the value of money. Technology will change daily life. Entire industries may appear or disappear. And through all of it, the experiment continues quietly in the background. Each year, the portfolio must still support everyday life. Each year, the balance between spending and sustainability must remain intact. Yet something interesting often happens during this phase. The longer people live with financial independence, the less they think about the number that once defined their goal. The FIRE number slowly loses its emotional power. Because by this point, the experiment is no longer about reaching freedom. It is about living with it. And living with freedom turns out to be more complex than most spreadsheets suggest. So what does the 40-year retirement experiment reveal? At first glance, it might sound like a criticism of early retirement. But that interpretation misses the deeper point. Financial independence can absolutely change a life. It can reduce pressure. It can create flexibility. It can give people more control over their time. It can allow someone to step away from work that drains their energy and move toward work that feels meaningful. In that sense, the FIRE movement has helped many people rethink their relationship with money. That matters. But the experiment also reveals something quieter. Money can buy freedom, but it cannot automatically design a meaningful life. A person can retire early and still face questions about purpose. A person can achieve financial independence and still experience market uncertainty. A person can reach the destination and discover that the journey continues in unexpected ways. This does not make FIRE unrealistic. It simply makes it human, because life is not a straight financial equation. It is a long sequence of changing circumstances, changing priorities, changing responsibilities, changing identities. The problem is not the desire for freedom. The problem is assuming freedom will be simple. Perhaps the goal was never simply to escape work as early as possible. Perhaps the deeper goal was always something more subtle, the ability to choose. To choose how we spend our time. To choose what kind of work matters to us. To choose the balance between security and freedom. Early retirement is one possible outcome of that journey. But it is not the only one. And sometimes the most valuable form of financial independence is not the ability to stop working forever. It is the ability to live without fear controlling your next decision. The hidden problem behind FIRE is not that freedom fails. It is that freedom once achieved still asks difficult human questions. And in the end, the real experiment may not be about how early someone can retire. It may be about how intentionally someone chooses to live.